COG was put in place to create a gigantic underground establishment of a government in the event of a nuclear war in the 1950s. Now, when we take that infrastructure over time, what happens is it gets out of the way of responsible leadership under the presidential umbrella, and it gets into clandestine hands. And the way that it shows up is that every time there's a deep event, which is something that Professor Scott has pointed out, whether it was Watergate or Iran-Contra or 9/11 or even the coup of 2008, people associated with continuity of government always show up in the middle of it. That goes all the way back to the Kennedy administration. So that group has its representatives, and for a long time, you couldn't even say the word COG in Congress. This is the interesting thing. Professor Scott makes a good point about this, which is COG in and of itself is just a structure. And that network, the secret network, the Doomsday Network, can be used by good people or bad people. But if it gets in the wrong hands, as it has in the past, we've seen, in Kennedy's case, Winston Lawson was the Secret Service agent who used the Doomsday Communication Network for Dallas for setting up the route that they were on. So he was a clear case of somebody from that Doomsday Network who came in and participated in the deep event of Kennedy's assassination. Also had a lot of sketchy recollections that were completely untrue about the incident of the assassination. When you go to Watergate, you're surrounded by COG people. John Dean, who is Nixon's lawyer, he had just come out of continuity of government, and his girlfriend had also worked in continuity of government. One of the main Watergate burglars had just come out of the COG. So we're seeing these people around these events. Then when you get to 9/11, you've got Rumsfeld and Cheney who set the structure up, restructured it in the 80s, and they're utilizing it and calling COG when you get the September 11th attacks. So, throughout American history, if you look at Iran-Contra or the October surprise, where they told the Iranians, don't return those hostages because we'll give you a better deal, that's all COG Communications Network people involved. So Iran-Contra, they're utilizing, and the Iran-Contra is very little understood, but it's a massive fraud, and it is also diverting directly. So it's giving these missiles to Iran, which is an enemy, and it's saying the proceeds from those missiles, which we're collecting, we're going to give to the people we're supporting in Central America, the Contras, to fight the Nicaraguan government because the Nicaraguan government is being Russian friendly. But Congress had cut off funding for those Contras because of a series of things. One, they were involved in drug running, and two, they were involved in different types of atrocities. And I'm sure the people fighting with them were too. It was just a mess. But nonetheless, like it or not, the Congress had cut off the funding. So to do this, to sell American arms to Iran, which was an enemy, and then take the money and give it in the back channel to a group that we were trying to support in this other country, it was all CIA, Ollie North, Bush, and that whole activity. And a lot of people went to prison as a result. And the whole idea was, did Reagan know about it or did he not? And from my own study of it, he didn't. And the whole operation was run through George Bush. But what's interesting is one of the things about Iran-Contra is it started a big flow of money fraud again. So the question had always become, what did they need all that money for at the time? And it's come up in different lines of research that they were using the UFO threat idea on Reagan because they had shown him some very unusual NASA footage of these ships, and these ships were fueling off the rings of Saturn. And, there's a whole thing about Norm Berglund, and he came out saying, I was the scientist who did this and all the rest. And I think it's absolutely true. Now, the thing is, out of that, Reagan starts talking about what if we had an alien threat, and we find out years later from Mikhail Gorbachev, they sit together and talk at Reykjavik, and Reagan asked him, look, will you help us in the event of an alien attack? This is what he's looking at. And of course, this is a very important figure and point that this is a point I make when it comes to the presidents of America and Russia meeting, which is the CIA. It's their worst nightmare. Because if those guys get together and talk about the UFO file, the CIA is cut out of the loop and they can't afford that. So they've freaked out on a number of occasions, JFK with Khrushchev, Reagan with Gorbachev, and particularly Trump with Putin. They don't want those guys getting together and talking the UFO file president to president. They always want these things that are involved. So there's a lot of that involved. If we look at it, the kind of COG corruption that leans over, and then you're like, why are they using that level of corruption? Are they just using it for some criminal enterprise? Well, the things that they're doing are anti-constitutional, like selling missiles to an enemy, for example. But when you get to September 11th, when they use COG, that's their dry run. They're like, let's see how this works. And, here's an actual situation. And on the surface, you say, oh, it's a terrorist attack by these planes. Although anybody logical looking at that, taking the time to go through the 9/11 event, it's just not believable. So whatever it was that was going on, maybe the anticipated attack and simulated one, there's just a lot of unanswered questions about it. Some of the things that I've heard that are convincing is that they had so much in the black budget that they needed to put on budget that they decided this was the big way for them to do that, because otherwise everybody was going to jail. And we know that Rumsfeld was talking about missing money the day before, and we've had Catherine Austin Fitz's study on this. So we're well educated on that front of things. But the question is, this deep state structure, which is committing these different acts, and the deep events that they're committing always seem to involve the COG people. So it seems like the deep state and the COG thing is a lock. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that deep state research, and now I'm going to introduce the UFO file aspect as we look at it, because COG is becoming very relevant when we look at the fact that Cheney's daughter is the one that they're touting as a president when she has absolutely no support, either Republican or Democrat. What's going on there?
There had been strong signals that the military were usurping the civil responsibility for foreign policy as early as 1992. The Pentagon, under the supervision of Paul Wolfowitz, produced a document labeled Defense Planning Guidance, Post-Cold War Strategy, which later became known as a Plan for a New American Century. It was a very aggressive blueprint for military expansion that included a number of proposed wars in the Middle East. When the original draft was leaked to the New York Times in March 1992, the reaction was so negative that it had to be withdrawn and rewritten in more acceptable language. One of the suggestions in the original document was that the American people might be difficult to sell on such an aggressive interventionist policy in the absence of some incident, like another Pearl Harbor. The principal authors became key members of the George W. Bush administration, thanks largely to Dick Cheney and his transformation team. In due course, they got their incident like Pearl Harbor, when 2 airplanes flew into towers at the Trade Center in New York on September the 11th, 2001. The press dutifully reported what had happened, but no investigative reporters were assigned to determine how 2 planes, with neither the kinetic nor heat energy necessary to bring down even 1 building, were responsible for the destruction of 5. 1,000 architects and engineers were convinced that the official explanation was incorrect. The late Major General retired, Albert Stubelbein III, former chief of all of the U.S. Army intelligence services around the world, at his wife's suggestion, connected the dots and came to the very unhappy conclusion that the public had been duped. Totally convincing is Dr. Judy Wood's 500-page book entitled Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11. She doesn't point fingers. She merely says, look at the evidence. And that advice should have been taken by people in high places. Meanwhile, the negative consequences for Americans and citizens of the world is probably unequaled in all of recorded history. In the real world of near total secrecy, the military-industrial intelligence group used the incident to justify a 100% increase in defense expenditures at a time when they were already twice as great as necessary to more than cope with any possible enemy. The Pentagon became careless in financial record keeping, to the point where Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld admitted $2 trillion were missing and unaccounted for.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
More recently, the figure for missing funds has escalated to 21 trillion. That figure was 21 trillion, not 21 billion. No defense department could get away with that in a democracy. Meanwhile, in the real world of near total secrecy of the shadow government or cabal or military-industrial intelligence group, whatever you want to call it, has built up military and lethal force, short of war, unprecedented in the recorded history of planet Earth.
21 trillion. How? All right. Short answer.
So here's the thing.
Go ahead.
If I can steal 21 trillion, I assure you I have the resources to manipulate and manage the bond market, the stock market,
you got
the precious metals market, and the crypto market. In fact, if you look at what I'm hacking on cryptos, that's enough to manipulate the crypto market.
Wow. All right. Are we talking about the elite of the elite, the Illuminati of the Illuminati, the world control mechanism? What are we talking? Who are these guys?
So what, if you go back and you look at the history of the development of the hidden system of finance and the black budget, it makes perfect sense. So, this has a long and deep history. 47 Act, then the 49 Act, we create the black budget. We seize the money from the Japanese and the Germans and create the hidden system of finance. And some of that money goes into the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is then set up to manipulate and manage.
Well, we got
market.
Yamashita's gold. I mean, that was a huge recovery, big score.
We open the United States up to narcotics.
Yeah.
Which is one of the great capital generators, of the Western world.
Sure.
We watched Shanghai. We learned how Shanghai Shek did it, and we brought it back and did it ourselves. And then, the big punch through comes when Bush becomes vice president and gets control of the enforcement and intelligence lines after having been the...
That's George Herbert Walker for you listening.
And what he does is he creates through executive orders the ability to have private corporations do highly classified functions. So what you've now done by adding that to the 47 and the 49 Act and what you've done in the ESF and the hidden system of finance, you've basically put the intelligence agencies in the business of being the most powerful banker in the world, number one, and you combine that with their covert operations capacity. But then you say, okay, we can use the federal credit and issue bonds to create an unlimited stream of privately owned and controlled black technology and stock market profits.
It's a whole black economy. It's that shadow economy that we've talked about for many years on the program, but it's even bigger than most people can imagine.
So let me keep going. So during the 80s, we see the development of financial fraud. And, the same group that basically assassinated Kennedy in 1963, the fraud grows and grows, and they can't believe during the 80s, it's called Iran-Contra, how much they got away with it. Mm-hmm. And then I was part of the cleanup who came in 89, so we cleaned up the Iran-Contra fraud. Well, then they came back and they did it again. And what happened with the housing bubble in the 90s is you saw the same people, the same tools, the same deals, but this time they added the stock market and derivatives, which took it global and turbocharged it. And
Got it.
And basically what happened when you passed the Uruguay round of GATT and created the WTO in 95, I'll never forget, I was working, in the Bush administration, I became convinced that these guys were going to get a hold of the technology and basically turn the world into a dictatorship. So I became convinced that entrepreneurs had to get the tools mm-hmm. and basically re-engineer the economy and come up with...
Oh, that was your motivation this whole time. I get it.
Yeah. So I said, look, what we need is a decentralized thing, basically a decentralized model that can create more wealth than tyranny. Because that, mm-hmm. you don't want to get me started on the economic problems of tyranny, and that's not the major problem with tyranny in the first place. But anyway, so freedom is much more economically productive. It produces a much bigger pie than tyranny. So anyway, so off I went, and what basically happened was there was a decision instead to do a financial coup. So I presented my findings to a group of the top pension fund advisors in the country, mm-hmm. and my pitch was if we re-engineer the government investment to be environmentally and economically healthy for people and places on a place-based basis, the pension funds will make a fortune. They'll be able to pay the boomers' retirement, and the taxpayer will be hugely better off. We'll all be better off. So I made the presentation in spring of 1997. Remember, the fiscal year started that October 1997 for the fiscal.
Who did you present to?
So I presented to the top pension fund leaders in the country who were on a board. They were on the advisory board of one of my subsidiaries in Hamilton.
Okay.
And the president of CalPERS, the largest pension fund in the country, was there, wonderful man. Mm-hmm. And I showed them a pro forma of how we could re-engineer the federal investment for the Philadelphia area. We're out at Safeguard Scientifics outside of Pennsylvania, one of the top investors there. And I showed the presentation, and the president of CalPERS froze, and he looked at me and he said, "You don't understand. It's too late." I said, "What do you mean it's too late? It's not too late. If you look at the numbers, it's not too late at all. There's plenty of time, plenty of room to turn the ship around." He said, "You don't understand." He said, "They've given up on the country. They're moving all the money out starting in the fall," which was fall of 1998. He said, "You've got to get to Nick Brady." Nick Brady had been the chairman of Dillon Reed and then the secretary
Nicholas
of Treasury.
Brady. So, yeah.
Right. So I had worked for Nick when I was at Dillon Reed, so I knew Nick Brady. So he said, "You've got to get to Nick because they've given up on the country. They're moving all the money out." Now, I thought, Jeff, what he meant was they're reallocating the pension funds to invest in the emerging markets. I was wrong, because it was exactly that October 1st when all the money started to go missing. And there was huge money just flying out of the government, and it was turning up, and all these different investors were suddenly getting $1 billion, $2 billion to invest in China, and you think, where's all this money coming from? And in fact, I started to due diligence. I was looking for where they were laundering these billions of dollars, and that's why I started to look so carefully and write about Enron. Because one of my theories was that Enron was laundering all the money being pulled out of DOD and HUD. And I will bet you $1, now that I've looked at what they were doing on the Clinton Foundation, I will bet you the money being stolen out of HUD was what funded and founded the Clinton Foundation, the Blair Foundation, and Jeffrey Epstein's operation.
Here, I'm going to give you a small biographical snippet that Dick Cheney wrote when talking about 9/11. And here he says, the U.S. government was functioning. The president was safe. The attack had not succeeded in shutting us down. Speaking of 9/11, which, as we know, there's so many questions about 9/11, and to take it seriously on face value is ridiculous. The idea of somebody in a cave with cell phones directed a bunch of box cutters to take down the United States air defense system, which the Russians and the Chinese and nobody else could have done through all those years, but somehow these guys were able to do it. And this story and the idea that they probably used remote control planes. That's one aspect that I think is important. But the other aspect that I think is crucial is that you can't fly a plane into the Pentagon. There's a lot of weird things in relation to 9/11, but that one always stands out because you can't get near the Pentagon. They have their own sort of air defenses, and it's just never going to happen. One of the interesting things that happened after this explosion took place there is Donald Rumsfeld, who's the defense secretary, who, during a time when a terrorist attack is occurring, there are rules about a defense secretary. They need to go into this secret structure and plan with the president and all this stuff. And what does he do? He shows up on the lawn of the Pentagon taking someone out in a stretcher for the ultimate photo op, right? Just would never happen. So there are a lot of weird things about 9/11. I have a whole collection around it from my conversations with Jim Marrs and Peter Dale Scott, and it's pretty well identified that they selected the designated culprits, all of Lee Harvey Oswald, beforehand, and within something like 20 minutes, they knew, oh, these are the 19 guys you're looking for. One of the ways that they knew that, which always grabbed me as hilarious and absurd on the face of it, is there's an FBI agent walking down the streets of Manhattan, and he sees this piece of paper sort of tumbling in the air, and it lands on top of a pile of rocks from the rubble from the 9/11 towers. And he goes over and he's like, what is this? And he picks it up, and you know what? It's a passport from one of those darn hijackers. Well, that's good and handy he found that, because that helped them put the pieces together. So that's the official story, that an FBI agent found a passport of one of the terrorists on top of that rubble. So you can see the nature of this is farcical, but it's dangerous too, because like the Kennedy assassination, it sits out there swinging in the breeze, and the credibility of the whole nation swings with it. But they were able to amass mighty changes, including the September 11th emergency structure that we live under now, from which they can call continuity of government. And we know the continuity of government was enacted by Dick Cheney on September 11th. And that's how you get the Patriot Act and all those wonderful things like the TSA. Here's a couple of interesting quotes from firemen during 9/11 that kind of give us, I think, just a few things to reflect on. So I want to read these. FDNY firefighter John Cohn, who was in the South Tower, recalls he had called his father and said, quote, I finally got through to my father and said, I'm alive. I just wanted to tell you, go to church, I'm alive. I just so narrowly escaped this thing. He said, where were you? You were there? I said, yeah, I was right there when it blew up. He said, you were there when the planes hit? I said, no, I was there when it exploded. The building exploded. He said, you mean when it fell down? I said, no, when it exploded. I totally thought it had been blown up. That's just the perspective of looking at it. It seemed to have exploded out. This is one of the interesting testimonies that came out that was not supposed to come out. I'm going to show you why. On September 11th, 2001, Thomas von Essen, the fire commissioner of New York City, ordered that oral histories be gathered from first responders, firefighters, and medical workers, like that one. He wanted to preserve the accounts of what they experienced at the World Trade Center in the weeks and months following 9/11. 503 oral histories were taken. However, they were never released to the public. The 2002 mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, refused to have them released. We know Bloomberg real well. For some reason, they didn't want that little piece out.
Well, last week, a video surfaced of the attacks on the Twin Towers on 9/11. Twitter users posted this video as if it was brand new, never seen before. It might have been never seen for many of us. Turns out that's not true. This video was not new at all. It was broadcast years ago on television. But why was it buried? And what does it show us? And why has it suddenly surfaced during the same week that President Biden steps down from running for re-election? President Trump is nearly assassinated and gives a speech at the RNC. This news surfaces during that same week. It is curious Indeed. Ted Walter, he's the executive director for the International Center for 9/11 Justice. He's dedicated his life to getting answers for the families and the victims of 9/11. He's also the director of Peace, War, and 9/11, which is available on their channel, a documentary you can watch. And Ted joins us now. No better authority on this probably in the world to dissect this video. Now, the video, Ted, has been viewed like 50 million times. And of course, it was put out there as this is brand new video, but can you explain to our audience, is this video new or just resurfaced?
Yeah, so as I was analyzing the video, I discovered that it actually had aired before, at least about 10 seconds or so, showing the collapse of the South Tower, which was the first building to go down on 9/11. So that little segment has aired on Sky News and a Washington, D.C. affiliate of CBS. However, the filmmaker or the videographer, Case Sugimoto, released about 57 minutes of footage. And so most of that has never been seen before, and it contains a lot of valuable information. And the portion of the South Tower that had been seen before is also now, we have it in a much better quality. So we can actually see a lot more things that we couldn't see before. So it is pretty significant.
Now, we should point out, of course, your position, I think our position here at Redacted, is that this was a controlled demolition of the towers and that these airplanes were not the reason these towers came down. Is that an accurate description of your position on this?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that the Twin Towers, as well as World Trade Center Building 7, were brought down by controlled demolition. So, and this video certainly confirms that in numerous ways.
All right, let's talk about it. So let's get into it. So this new video that people have never seen before, a large portion of it, confirms a controlled demolition of the towers on 9/11. Can you go through some of the points here that you'd like to make, and we can call out what caught your eye kind of looking at this new footage?
Yeah, so I think the thing that stood out to most people when they saw this was the flashes that are very visible. Particularly, there's a line of flashes on the lower portion of the building as the top starts to go down. I would also love to draw people's attention to a very bright flash that occurs further up on the building, and this is on the northeast corner of the South Tower. And when you think about it, there's no reason for a bright flash, if this is just a natural building collapse, to be occurring well above the impact zone or well above where the collapse is actually happening. But we see this bright flash, and we also see structural damage to the corner of the building very close to it. And so naysayers will say, well, those are just, who knows what that is? That's just the sun reflecting off the windows. Well, we know that this is actually something else other than that. And we think that it's a demolition charge because you can actually identify the same flash in numerous videos. If you line up the videos and you can do this carefully and line them up. And we actually just published a paper 2 months ago in the Journal of 9/11 Studies that has done this meticulous analysis that shows that this particular flash can be seen in numerous videos. So there's no way that if it's a reflection from the sun off of a window that you're going to see that same flash at that same moment from numerous angles. It can only be seen from one angle. And so we get this bright flash, and so you can look at the video of that. I've provided that video so your viewers can see it. We've kind of pointed out where that flash is. And very close to that flash, kind of where the arrow is pointing, you also see structural damage being done to the corner of the building. Again, if you have the top that's falling and it's a rigid block, right, and the damage that should be done to that portion of the building should be at the bottom. Why is there structural damage being inflicted upon a part of the building that's it's 10 or 15 stories higher, right? And so in that paper I mentioned in the Journal of 9/11 Studies by a researcher named Soren Korsgaard, he looks at that damage from a few different angles. Now that we have this video, we can really see that damage even much better. It's basically a big hole in the corner of the building. So if it's just window light reflecting off of windows, it's not going to cause damage, to that kind of damage to the building. But so we see that severe structural damage associated with the flash and a couple of flashes way above the impact zone. So
this really confirms what you've already seen. I mean, that's powerful, right? I mean, even without this video, you were able to determine that there were charges going off above where we were supposed to have this impact zone.
Yes. So and I provided a second video for your viewers to see, where it's another video where the researcher Soren Korsgaard identified this flash from another angle. And this is filmed by a guy named Anthony Rosario. And I mean, you can see the flash there very brightly. Notice that you can't see it in the you can't see the damage to the building as well because it's from a different angle. But what that shows you is that this flash actually was a very three-dimensional event. It wasn't just it was sticking out far from the building, right? So the new footage helps us really confirm, solidify what we knew, and it provides a much better view of the actual damage, and of course shows the video to tens of millions of people who've now seen it.
For someone who's just learning about this for the first time, wait a minute, there were demolition charges that brought down the towers? There were all sorts of eyewitnesses, firefighters, police officers, eyewitnesses who confirmed explosions and demolition charges going off, did they not?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's upwards of 200 eyewitness accounts of explosions going off during the collapse of the towers. The great majority of them are first responders, such as firefighters or Port Authority police officers, but also, several dozen news reporters. In fact, I co-authored a paper where we identified 36 reporters who basically described the collapse of the buildings as being an explosion or being brought down by explosives or that sort of thing, or seeing, explosions running down the face of the building. So there's overwhelming wealth of eyewitness evidence that explosions were taking place.
And of course, Building 7, which people said, it was collateral damage, basically hit by the falling Twin Towers. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And that it collapsed with, again, demolition charges, it appears, separate from the Twin Towers. It was not touched by the Twin Towers collapse at all. Am I right?
There was some damage done to the south face of the building, which was the face of Building 7 that was facing the towers. But it was, I won't call it minor damage because that will seem like I'm trying to downplay it. But NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which conducted the official investigation into the collapse of all three buildings, concluded that the damage to the building didn't actually contribute to the collapse. The damage, it was all due to fires, and that even if that damage had not taken place, if the fires had just traveled through the same fires had traveled through the building, they would have brought the building down anyway, allegedly. So all that the debris from the North Tower allegedly did was start these fires. That's even a question if the debris could have started those fires. Many researchers believe that the fires were set intentionally around noon in order to have a cover story for why the building would go down.
And what was in Building 7?
Oh, so good question. There were many government agencies, federal agencies, as well as a city agency inside the building. And we're talking about, the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was at the time conducting very important investigations into the WorldCom and Enron scandals. And then you had the Emergency Operations Center for the Office of Emergency Management of New York City that was installed just a couple years before 9/11 on the 23rd floor. And so, it's very suspicious that the Emergency Operations Center was evacuated so quickly on the morning of 9/11. And there's well-known eyewitness accounts of explosions. Two men who tried to go up to the 23rd floor, found it deserted, tried to make their way back down, and witnessed explosions when they got to around the 8th floor of the building. And the official story tries to say that that was actually just the North Tower collapsing onto the building. But we have when you look at the timeline for their account, there's no way that they would have only made it down to the 8th floor at 10:28 when the North Tower collapsed. It clearly happened much earlier, and they both clearly reported explosions. And we have actual reports of significant structural damage inside of Building 7, elevator cars being ejected from their shafts. So that's not going to be caused by debris hitting the outside of the building. If you got an elevator car sitting 40 feet outside of its shaft, that means basically an explosion pushed that elevator car out of the shaft.
Wow. Yeah, it's very convenient, all of the documents and things that were scorched in the collapse of Building 7 in these investigations. Very, very interesting. So I want to go back to the video here before we get you out of here, Ted. So we talked about the flashing. What else stood out to you about this new footage that's emerged?
Yeah, so there's other really interesting things you can see. I think there was a very good view of a squib, or an expulsion of debris and air that occurred just below the impact zone, really before the towers, the top of the building started come down. And my friend and colleague, Richard Gage, made that observation, or his team made that observation and put it out on his social media. And so you can see the video of that, which I provided for your audience. And then I found a second video. Once I saw that, I was like, wow, found a second video of that. There's just no reason for a squib to be shooting out of the building, starting to shoot out of the building before the top begins to come down. And really, you had a massive hole in the building, right, where the plane went in. So there's no reason that air would be pushed out of nearby parts of the building. If the top starts to come down, the air will just be pushed out the hole. And yet you've got this squib shooting out of the southeast corner of the South Tower, right about as the building starts to go down. So you can see that from a few different angles. I think the other really fascinating thing, and this goes to the sort of the historical significance of this video, in case Sugimoto releasing it, is his friends who watched the first tower go down. And then when people that they were with started asking them about it, they all said, "Oh, we think it went down. It was an explosion. We think." And one of the witnesses said, "Yeah, I don't think it was the fires." And so I think that's a real, it's another. There are numerous other examples of that. People who were recording the event but watching it outdoors, who were not that far away, who that's what they perceived as soon as the building came down. And your viewers can watch a couple of those videos, which I also provided. They're very powerful, and I think it's significant because it shows people, oh yeah, the original interpretation of what happened, the dominant view of most people who actually watched this event, who were close to it, who were eyewitnesses, they interpreted it as an explosion or as some kind of a demolition or the building blowing up. They did not interpret this as a natural building collapse. And I think that's, for people that are coming to this for the first time, it helps to realize that this theory, quote unquote theory, started from the second the buildings came down, and that's what most people who are close by observed. And so it's a natural way to interpret the event that you're seeing. And in fact, the idea that it was a structural failure caused by fires was really introduced afterwards. In the hours after these buildings went down, that's when you start to see the media saying, "Oh, it looks like it was a structural failure. It looks like the airplanes and the fires caused it." And all the reporters who were on the ground saying that it was an explosion, their accounts were ignored by their colleagues in the studios and so on. So I think that
a lot of those reporters' footage has been really blocked and hard to find, right? So a lot of these reporters who were there on the ground at the time, one of my colleagues at Fox News standing there on the ground talking about explosions and interviewing eyewitnesses and first responders about explosions that they were hearing. Good luck trying to find those videos today. Thank God for Twitter being able to resurface some of them, but you will not find them on the official news websites of the broadcast networks that initially aired those interviews, right?
Oh yeah, you can't find them anywhere related to the Fox News or any of the other channels that aired them. You can find them on our website, our YouTube channel. You can find them on the websites of our colleagues in our community who are still researching this and trying to get to the bottom of what happened that day and get the truth out and hold some people accountable. So it is still out there in certain places that are preserving it.
During the 9/11 Commission, and let's see if I can tie in this Governor Kane, Leslie Kane UFO piece with this. The 9/11 Commission called in Bush and Cheney for testimony, and they said, "You can't do it. We're not going to testify." And they said, "You have to, pressure built and all the rest of it." And they said, "Okay, we'll testify, but not under oath. And we have to be together so that we keep our story straight. The other guy doesn't screw up the story." The meeting with Bush and Cheney took place in secret, April 29th, 2004. It was not held under oath. No transcript was made available of their conversation with the commissioners. Nothing was learned about why the president remained at an elementary school during the attacks. Nothing was learned about what the president knew regarding foreign intelligence agencies forewarning the U.S. Nothing was learned about why the president had authorized America to prepare for war against Afghanistan in the days and weeks prior to the attacks of September 11th. They were already going to war with Afghanistan. And we still don't know any of those answers. So, in fact, the problem over and over again in our country of the United States is accountability. From the Kennedy assassination, no accountability of the CIA organizing his assassination. Watergate. They don't even know what, we've gone through a number of different things about what Watergate was about. The official story is absurd. That they were, just going in to bug the office. And it's, they do that all the time. Why would you send 5 ex-CIA guys and 2 Cuban exiles in there to do something like that? So very, very strange. 9/11, no answers to any of that. But we did get a much more fascist-oriented society as a result with the Patriot Act, warrantless wiretapping, torture, which they supposedly got rid of. And now those terrorists they held up as the Middle Eastern terrorists so we could go into places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Now it's all circled around, and anyone who's their domestic enemy is now a terrorist. And this is where we find ourselves in 2021. What we need to do is see that COG machine going into overdrive. Donald Rumsfeld, who's the defense secretary at the time, who recently passed away, he said something very interesting, which is that he didn't know the towers had been hit until 15 minutes after it happened. And then, of course, he was seen on the lawn of the Pentagon carrying out a stretcher. The Secretary of Defense, there's real protocols when there's a terrorist attack. He can't be seen publicly. He's surrounded by bodyguards. He's taken into an underground shelter, all this kind of stuff. But instead, he was on the Pentagon lawn carrying a stretcher. And he also said, those planes hit, but I didn't find out about it. Well, I guess he didn't even have a television. So in another interview later on, someone called in, it was like 2005, 2006, and he had put a book out, being like The Horror of 9/11 or something. And just to show his contempt for his audience and the general contempt of the government for the governed, a caller called in and said, hey, what about Building 7? And he said, what's Building 7? What's Building 7? Well, Building 7 is the building that came down, even though it wasn't hit by any planes. That was right there, the towers. But it wasn't hit by the towers, and it wasn't hit by any planes, but it went down anyway. But Rumsfeld, good old Rummy's response, it's interesting. It's a strange step to go from being the defense secretary in 1976, take 25 years off, be a pharmaceutical executive, but in the meantime, set up COG, then become the defense secretary in 2001 when you're going to use COG for the first time. I mean, it actually had been used, but first time on the record that COG has been used.
And then in 2002, after 9/11, the hole in the Pentagon, I queried my dad on that. I said, this stinks. I think it's a Tomahawk missile. There's no debris. I'm a pilot. I said, there's insufficient debris. There's no jet engines, no luggage. Where's the wings going in I started all this stuff. And he said, that's the one topic I will not talk with you about. And that was basically saying father to son code. Go research it on your own. You're damn right it was a Tomahawk missile. Now figure out on your own why. The who's, the whys, the wherefores, all that stuff.
On September 10th, Donald Rumsfeld gave a press conference admitting to the $2.3 trillion. We thought he was trying to get ahead of the story because we knew it would blow on September 15th. Well, it never ran. Yes. It ran several weeks later, and we know what happened.
Yes, indeed.
Right, and here's what's interesting. If you look at the mortgage fraud involved, I believe, in the missing money story, many of those companies went down or got impacted, and many of the offices that were doing the investigation of those companies came down in the towers. And then, of course, whatever hit the Pentagon hit the office that was doing that.
Well, the auditors were in there, correct? All the
money. Right.
The paperwork, the auditors killed them all, basically.
Right.
Cruise missile, no doubt, something like that. It targeted, and they're gone.
But if you look
and
at
the OKC bill, remember? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, if you look at the records related to the missing money and because you said to me, how could you steal that much money? Securities fraud is how you steal that much money.
Oh.
So if you look at all the records that were blown up in the SEC, FBI, and those different offices, and as we know, suddenly, right after 9/11, there were massive settlements between the SEC and Department of Justice and the different securities firms. And, of course, many records were blown up. The Army, for several years, said they couldn't produce financial statements because their whole capacity blown up, which I don't begin to understand since it's supposed to be out in Ohio, but that's what they said. At that point, you had the guy running the Army who was a former executive of Enron.
This is astonishing, just
you can't
incredible.
Make this stuff up.
No.
But here's, I've never been able, it wasn't until Dr. Skidmore that I was able to get the capacity to really have someone go through, survey the work, and look at it from the point of view who's somebody who's a serious scholar in the area of.
Well, he and his grad students came to the rescue for sure.
Yeah, no, that was definitely the cavalry. And because this is something that is so extraordinary and so big, it's too big certainly for one set of eyes. You need many smart people looking at it. I think the reason it hasn't gotten traction is people are afraid. What you're talking about is a budget, a federal budget, that is financing two civilizations and pretending one doesn't exist.
Talk to some people. Well, when 9/11 happened, I don't want to go too far into this, except to say I have a gentleman who was the third highest ranking man at the Naval Research Labs, who prior to 9/11, in the Vice President's office, Vice President Cheney's, saw all the plans for 9/11 prior to it occurring. He's deceased, since I'm talking about it now. I did not talk about it for years. And he was told, I used to stay at my home. He said, look, I was told my wife and my children and my grandchildren would be killed along with me if I ever mentioned this. He took it to his grave, gave me the information. God bless him, Rick Foch, who was a very high-ranking scientist, an aerospace figure in the Naval Research Labs, which is the biggest Department of Defense lab. So when 9/11 happened, which was about 4 or 5 months after the 2001 disclosure event, where we had hundreds of thousands of people contacting Congress to hold hearings on this issue, which of course when 9/11 happened, that fell way to the back burner very quickly. And they then said, well, we got to go get those guys in Afghanistan. Then they did something else, another false flag. They concocted false intelligence, yellow cake, remember the story yellow cake, uranium out of Africa. They made up all these stories. And they put poor Colin Powell up before the UN holding a vial of anthrax and other biological and chemical weapons, saying that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had these. He did not. And he was put up there thinking that he was being provided accurate intelligence when he was not. And there are people on the inside who have come forward saying that they knew that that intelligence was wrong or very likely wrong. But based on that, we went into Iraq, where we are still embroiled, blew up that whole area of the world. Now we have ISIS. And this was all planned and known with malice aforethought. So we don't have to reach back thousands of years with Trojan horses and machinations of Machiavellian psychopaths who have been militarists in the course of human history. We only need gaze back from Vietnam to today to see the extent to which these false flag operations hoaxed events, exaggerated threats can stampede a populace and the Congress and the presidency into very dangerous and bad decisions.
Let me go through what happened in Iraq, just for, give me 1 minute to summarize. We were tricked into Iraq by the neocons, who told us that Saddam, who had something to do with the World Trade Center, which was a lie, that he had planted the anthrax attacks that came 5 days after the World Trade Center, which was a lie. That turned out to be, the intelligence agencies and the U.S. military at Fort Detrick. That anthrax, the FBI found, came from Fort Detrick. So it was somebody in the U.S. government who sent it to Patrick Leahy and Tom Daschle, who were the two senators in the week after 9/11 who were trying to block the Patriot Act. And it shut down Congress, and the Patriot Act went through. And and then they told us.
Wait. Really?
Yeah. Yes. And the FBI, after a year of investigation, traced the anthrax. It was a kind of Ames anthrax that was weaponized, and the only source of that in the world could be the U.S. government. And they traced it to Fort Detrick.
So the biolab there?
Yes, the biolab at Fort Detrick, the CIA biolab at Fort Detrick. So somebody sent that in at the time the Patriot Act was being debated, and the two leading guys who were blocking it was Patrick Leahy and Tom Daschle were the recipients of it. It shut down Congress. The Patriot Act goes through, and what does the Patriot Act do? Two things. I mean, it basically gets rid of a large part of the United States Constitution, Bill of Rights, and allows spying by intelligence agencies on the American people. And
probably you all know about the Iraq War and how we, through the Vice President Cheney's office, cherry-picked intelligence so that Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, would go to the UN and talk about the fearsome weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had. Now, I'm no fan of Saddam Hussein. He was obviously a thug and a dictator, and they're all over the world. However, he did not have those weapons, and it was known he did not have them. However, it was enough to stampede the American people and the Congress into a disastrous war. And it was all based on knowingly false and hoaxed, in some cases, intelligence. Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, who had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, by the way, it wasn't like he wasn't familiar with military and intelligence operations, admitted later that he was deceived, and his chief of staff went on the record saying that they were deceived by an intelligence operation out of the West Wing run by the Vice President Cheney. Of course, that ship sailed a while back. I'll get into some things that happened there that will stun you. And with electronic systems on satellites. But flashback to September 11th, 2001. The world is in shock. The American people are paralyzed with fear and grief. Over the next few days, an unprecedented show of solidarity and patriotism. Americans fly their flag from every car and hang them outside their homes. They unify around an overwhelmed president, brought together as one by terror and loss. Few raised an eyebrow as constitutionally protected freedoms disappeared and the war drum beat loud and unopposed. The 9/11 attack set the stage for an invasion agenda that had been pre-planned for years, as General Wesley Clark revealed in a 2007 interview.
He said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. I said, is it classified? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me.
When Von Braun talked to me about this faked extraterrestrial, he called it a faked alien invasion that was being planned, I saw on a board a list of countries against whom we were going to build space-based weapons. I called Wesley Clark and he answered the phone. And I said, well, what is it about? And he said, well, I asked that question. What is it about? And the guy at the desk said, I don't know.
I said, we're going to war with Iraq. Why? He said, I don't know.
In its paper, published in 2000, Rebuilding America's Defenses, the neoconservative think tank Project for the New American Century asserted that only a, quote, new Pearl Harbor would generate the political will for the military and defense policy transformations the group desired. Indeed, these traumatizing events are always planned or hijacked in order to manipulate perception and manufacture consent for military action and the theft of our wealth and liberty.
George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and others had decided to go to war with Iraq long before Colin Powell gave that presentation. I feel like it was the lowest point in my professional and personal life that I had a hand in managing it.
Trouble. Let's not forget weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Well, where did that really come from? George Tenet. And what did he say? Oh, that intelligence is a slam dunk. Well, did we ever find any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? No. So we sent all those people in there. We spent all that money, all those American lives. Over 4,000 soldiers, American soldiers died in that war, untold Iraqi civilians. For what? Because the CIA had a relationship with the oil companies. This is the nature of the government aspect, why we need to understand the deep state and go in deeper. You have the official story in the case of 9/11, these hijackers got on a plane with box cutters and took down an air defense system that had been set up to avoid nuclear war. Okay, that's the United States air defense system had been set up during the Cold War. That means you couldn't thwart it with some hijackers. It wasn't going to happen. So, but the official story is that some guy in a cave controlled these people to do that. All right. And took down the biggest military in the entire world. So, and we know, in fact, there's so many inconsistencies 20 years later around that story. It just doesn't hold up at all, the official story. The secondary story, a lot of professors, including Professor Peter Dale Scott, a lot of writers, researchers, credible people went into it and said, here's a lot of the things that actually happened, including a lot of weird stock movements in the background while all this was going on relating to airlines and Homeland Security style equipment, because they created Homeland Security directly out of the 9/11 attacks. And it's relevant now to speak of 9/11 because Homeland Security is the ogre in the room that just keeps growing and growing. It's like Jabba the Hutt. And it's got 250,000 employees. It's getting fatter and fatter. Now it wants the disinformation board. This thing just, they want to basically control the United States through the idea of protection and that you'll be safe. We will protect you. So over and over again, we need to step back and take a look and say, well, how did we get into this? What is it exactly that took place here? And Department of Homeland Security is a good place to start. Fundamentally, conversations like the one that we're having here is what they're trying to stop, and we have to remember that and keep that in mind.
But we've come a long way since the 9/11 attacks. That same document that called for a new Pearl Harbor goes on to describe how we need to put weapons in space, and even predicts the creation of the Space Force. For a complete fascist takeover, the men behind the curtain will have to play their final card, a cosmic 9/11.
This temptation to generate a false flag attack on the part of some extraterrestrial civilization, you even hear people like Ronald Reagan make reference to it.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
Wouldn't it be clear if we all of a sudden found ourselves being attacked by an extraterrestrial civilization? We'd finally all come together. Wouldn't that be really lovely? Well, it's not really lovely for the industrial state. They don't want to lose their other enemies first. They want to use up all that before they go to that extreme.
The last card was the most profound experience I had in my whole life. And I accepted the mission. And until Stephen Greer picked me up and talked me into going to the Disclosure Project, when I had just about given up, that's when I saw that there were other witnesses to what's going on, to the truth, to the facts,
When she told me what Wernher von Braun had said, it didn't surprise me because I had previously met with a number of people in the defense industry and in the intelligence community who had already told me that there was such a plan and that it could be actuated at any moment. And that was one of the long-term agendas was keep the technologies away so we maintain our industrial base of fossil fuel and all this. When we're ready to pull the trigger on releasing this information, spin it in the direction that benefits the foxes guarding the henhouse, the people holding these secrets. But it was interesting to hear that all the way back in the early 70s that he had been warning her about this. And we know that those systems were developed actually in the late 40s and 50s.
Now, the mother lode, the sort of the crown jewel of that kind of event is what has been planned assiduously since the 1950s. And that is a threat from outer space that is alien, that would unite the world around a military junta, a militarism, that would put all of humanity together, but against one or more extraterrestrial races. Now that plan, which they came up with in the 1950s, has been very carefully rolled out. And as you know from my friend Carol Rosin, who was Wernher von Braun, the man who invented the rocket for Adolf Hitler, the V-2 rocket, and who then was brought in under Operation Paperclip by the OSS into our intelligence community and into our aerospace program after World War II. She said that on his deathbed, he said, look, first they had this plan, there would be the Cold War, when we could have had peace with the Soviet Union. Then there would be nations of concern and global terrorism. This we put out prior to 9/11, by the way. Then they would pull out the big one, and that is the threat from outer space. And it's all a lie. And that's what he kept saying, it's all a lie.
The ultimate dream of the dialectical war machine, the military-industrial complex, is to have this war with a potential extraterrestrial civilization. It's their dream of all times. You can roll into place all the kind of strictures of a national security state. You can spend literally trillions of dollars a year on massive military equipment, super high-tech equipment, et cetera. And so that it's logical that they would use that as an excuse. And we do know from repeated examples of it that the utilization of a false flag operation to initiate a war goes on over and over and over again. Our human family does that. The nation states do that. Hitler has done it. They dress up troops looking like some other neutral country they want to invade and have their own troops dress up like them and pretend they've assaulted somebody, and they rush in and attack that country. It's gone on and on.
The other part of it is the technology. So when people hear this information, they are shocked that beginning in 1954, October, we didn't need surface roads. We'd figured out zero-point energy from studying not only what humans were developing from the era of Tesla and T. Townsend Brown, who was the genius who was doing things with high voltage systems and crystals with things levitating. Literally, that was going on in the late 20s. And it was reproduced in Germany before World War II in the late 20s in the Kolosky-Frost experiment. What you see is that stream of covert research into high voltage, high frequency electromagnetic fields that would give you free energy and levitation, joined with the reverse engineering of extraterrestrial vehicles in the mid-40s and after Roswell, and perhaps even before Roswell. Add to that at the end of World War II, the OSS that became the CIA went to Germany and acquired a disc and also a bell-shaped object that Adolf Hitler was working on, which was his secret weapon, which this is 100% true, which was based on so-called anti-gravity and electromagnetic fields. Proper term is electromagnetic gravitic. So electromagnetogravitic, EMG. So those were brought over under Operation Paperclip. So all that secrecy from the World War II era on became more and more compartmentalized the more they had breakthroughs, including in October '54, gravity control was mastered. Now, a man who was at the Naval Research Labs, the biggest Department of Defense lab in the United States, personally told me that he was in the vault. And his name's Rick Foch. He had been in the vault and seen the documentation that we had mastered gravity control in October '54. And also, before that, this free energy, zero-point energy. So that means that if that were to come out, it would be the end of oil, gas, coal, nuclear power, centralized utilities, road construction, surface roads, engines and ships, rockets, jets, all of it's obsolete. We would lift the burden that we have placed upon Gaia because we have overstayed our welcome in terms of the technological system we're using, which is really an 1800s paradigm of fossil fuels. Even atomic power, nuclear power, is from the mid-40s. So everything since the mid-40s is in a black box, and we're killing the planet keeping it secret.
These days, the more I look at the technology that's been developed over the last 20, 30, 40 years, I look at the work of T. Townsend Brown, I look at the work of Paletnikov, I look at the work of these guys and the ARV, the Alien Reproduction Vehicle. I see these things and I see how much evidence there is that they were produced, and there's absolutely no reason we wouldn't have gone to the moon on established basis, or gone to Mars on established basis.
With their secret financing and high technology, it would seem that there's every bit of evidence to show that there is a secret space program. If this is so, then the follow-up question has to be, if they all have this technology hidden from us, is it possible that they're creating a parallel civilization to ours, a breakaway civilization?
I think it's worth suggesting that if there is a secret space program, then clearly it has some sort of agenda. You know, we're not talking about just, I think, going back to the moon for the sake of it and picking up a few rocks and stones here and there. There has to be an agenda, and I think that agenda would be to sort of further travel out into the solar system and beyond. Maybe they've even gone beyond, you know, the solar system itself. If that's the case, then we could be looking at an entire elite, if you like, on the planet, which has access to technology way beyond the rest of us, maybe technology to travel who knows where, and essentially they don't see themselves as just members of the human race like the rest of us. They see themselves as an elite which has the ability to, in the future, and maybe even now, do things that the rest of us will never do. And that creates sort of a hierarchy that operates outside of the regular confines of civilization. And that would be kind of profound and disturbing as well, the idea that somebody is running a program that the rest of us are completely left out of the loop of.
Let's go back to the Cold War and the space race. The Russians got their Nazi scientists, but they were focusing on heavy lift rockets. They could put big, heavy payloads up into space. That's why the Russians beat us to the first Sputnik, okay, the first satellite, Laika, the first dog in space, the first woman in space, first man to orbit the Earth, and we were starting to feel the pain. Wait a minute, what are we doing? Well, what we were doing was building miniaturized, computerized type equipment for trajectory and for all the scientific things needed for space travel. Okay? Now, what was happening is, and what nobody really knows and has not been plainly told to people, is that these Nazi scientists were in touch with each other. For example, most of the Nazi scientists early on working on the space program were headquartered down at El Paso. They got weekend passes. Nobody kept tabs with them. They didn't have guards going with them. They'd go right into Mexico. They'd send telephone messages and letters to their counterparts in Russia. And at the very top of the food chain, at the level of the international bankers, at the level of the John J. McCloy, who was the High Commissioner of Germany, but then also had been the largest lender of money through Citibank to Hitler and the Nazis, at that level, they put the two space programs together. They put the heavy lift rockets with the computerization, and then so all of these years when we've been paying our tax money and watching these big rockets lift off from Cape Canaveral, it's really quite impressive. Hey, over here, they had anti-gravity and they had very sophisticated stuff, and that was the beginning of a breakaway civilization.
When it comes to the idea of a secret space program, there's one issue which I think is very important. It doesn't necessarily relate to specifics, but if you think about it, We first landed on the moon, in terms of a manned mission at least, in July 1969. Now, if you look at the way in which every aspect of technology has advanced since then, computers, that were once the size of almost like a car, they're now like a matchbox. The internet, medical technology, everything has advanced to incredible degrees. But we're expected to believe that the same brute force rocketry that sent people to the moon in 1969 is still the only way to get people into space today. And to me, that is totally illogical when every other single aspect of technology has literally gone through the roof in terms of developments. Why is it then we're still relying upon rockets, brute force engines, and technology that actually really isn't advanced? The Saturn rocket wasn't advanced as such, it was just huge. And it's kind of the same situation today. And I find that very suspicious that we're still supposedly using rocket technology when every other technology has advanced. For that reason, I do think there probably is some sort of covert space program going on.
And this gets into Gary McKinnon, the fellow who was just a hacker, and he hacked into the Pentagon computers, basically looking to see if he could find for any proof on UFOs. And what he found was rosters and tables of organization for the space fleet. And the ships we have that are being made in secrecy, again, the blending of the space programs, and officers, named all the officers, even though the Pentagon themselves admit that he didn't do any harm to the Pentagon computers or to national security, but he's just telling tales out of school and they don't like it.
The United States government eventually dropped its case against Gary McKinnon. Perhaps the information was so sensitive they didn't want to risk going to trial. It is clear that someone is hiding very advanced technologies from the rest of humanity. It is also possible that these super technologies are being used by the elite to not only get off planet, but also to create a separate society from ours, a breakaway civilization, if you will.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
On September 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld testified in front of congressmen about $2.3 trillion missing from the Pentagon. In 2015, an Inspector General report came out detailing that number grew from $2.3 trillion to $6.5 trillion missing from the Pentagon. This money is going into unacknowledged projects both above our heads and below ground, into deep underground military bases and secret space programs with technology far beyond what many of us could even realize.
Our black budget, for instance, garners $1.023 trillion every 2 years. It's over $500 billion a year. Right now, there are 131 active deep underground military bases in the United States. There's 1,477 of them worldwide. Each one has an average cost of $17 to $19 billion. Each one is built in the site, it used to be, it'd take a year to 2 years to build each one. And now they're capable of building a couple of them a year with sophisticated methods. Area 51 is only one base, one of the 131 bases. Of these 131 bases, I call Area 51 a mega base. It's got more than one base in it. It's Tonopah Test Range, Area 51, S2, S4, Groom Lake, and a host of others. Now, these mega bases are gobbling up our gross national product. Right now, we're spending 28% of the gross national product on building underground bases solely.
China has built 50 different ghost cities that collectively are built to hold an estimated 64 million inhabitants, with apartment buildings, the roads, all of the infrastructure, all the plumbing, all the electrical, everything you need for a city, and there's nobody there. 50 cities, 64 million people. Now remember, China's gross domestic product is $11.2 trillion. They're not even spending a majority of their gross domestic product on these ghost cities, and yet they have the money to do it. It's only cost them a few $1 trillion. So once you start thinking about it that way, you start to see how much money $1,000 billion really is. $1 billion is a lot. If you're a billionaire, you can do anything you want. $1,000 billion is a sum of money that just gets dropped out there with this word trillion, but we're not really thinking about how it literally can build an entire civilization. The articles on China's ghost cities refer to it as China's multi-billion-dollar debt, not a debt in the trillions. In fact, in 2016, one estimate that I saw showed that the total estimated debt that China has gone into to build these ghost cities is only $2.5 trillion. Now that's 50 different cities that hold 64 million people, just because they think that as they continue to have a population boom, that they need to have a place where these people can eventually go. But literally nobody is there right now. So imagine what that means when you start tossing around a figure of the too big to fail banks needing a bailout that, according to Senator Ron Paul, was $29 trillion. You're talking about over 10 times the amount of money that China needed to build 50 different ghost cities that can hold millions and millions and millions of people. So then the question is, where did all this money go? The total amount of money in the world in the 2008 year of the collapse, the gross world product, or GWP, was only $60 trillion. So the theft of $29 trillion from the printed out of hot air US dollar is half of the wealth of the entire world. Try to wrap your head around this, because what I'm telling you is, from all the insiders I've been speaking to for the last 20 years, they are building civilizations. It's just not above ground where we see it on the surface of the planet. There is vast amounts of underground drilling. There are huge caverns, 20, 30 miles wide, that they've built out into gorgeous, elaborate cities, and they're building entire civilizations on planets and moons in our solar system. This is where the money is going.
Well, I have a copy of the Inspector General Act here in front of me, and it says, among other things, that it's your responsibility to conduct and supervise audits and investigations relating to the programs and operations of your agency.
That's correct.
So I'm asking you if your agency has, in fact, according to Bloomberg, extended $9 trillion in credit, which, by the way, works out to $30,000 for every single man, woman, and child in this country. I'd like to know, if you're not responsible for investigating that, who is?
At this point, we're conducting our lending facility project at a fairly high level and have not gotten to a specific level of detail to really be in a position to respond to your question.
Have you conducted any investigation or auditing of the losses that the Federal Reserve has experienced on its lending since last September?
We're still in the process of conducting that review. Until we actually, go out and gather the information, I'm not in a position to really respond to the specific question.
So are you telling me that nobody at the Federal Reserve is keeping track on a regular basis of the losses that it incurs on what is now a $2 trillion portfolio?
Until we actually look at the program and have the information, we are not in a position to say whether there are losses or to respond in any other way to that.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I have to tell you honestly, I am shocked to find out that nobody at the Federal Reserve, including the Inspector General, is keeping track of this.
What's amazing is that right now we're seeing the very first audit of the Pentagon ever. And this audit could very well begin to expose the trillions and trillions, upwards of even 21 trillion, if not more money than that, begin to be exposed. And we might even find out very soon where all this money actually went.
Let's go back now to the LIBOR scandal that happened in the wake of the 2008 economic collapse. LIBOR is an acronym that stands for London Interbank Offered Rate. And what we're finding is that these too big to fail banks are only appearing to be in competition with each other. The LIBOR scandal revealed that these guys are calling each other on the phone, colluding about how to rig their own interest rates so that one appears to be winning, one appears to be losing, but they're actually like branch offices of a single larger corporation. All of the apparent competition, oh, these guys' stock is going down, oh, it's a bloodbath. No. They're doing all this together. They're competing only on paper when in fact it's collusion. This is financial organized crime on such a massive scale. How can you arrest all the banks? They're too big to fail. This gets into a law that was passed in the United States in 1970 called the RICO Act, which stands for Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations. And that act was built to be able to take down massively organized crime. None of this really makes sense until you get back into the idea of the Federal Reserve System. Now, up until the Federal Reserve was founded in 1913, the United States essentially was in control of its own currency. This same banking cartel that we've been talking about worked behind the scenes to create a series of fake economic crises in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which caused regular Americans to have their savings wiped out. This became such a crisis that people were desperately calling for reform. And then the government comes along and says, look, we're bribed, corrupt politicians. We don't really know what we're doing. They have spokespeople saying these kinds of things in the media. Let's bring in the investors. Let's bring in the British bankers, the people who really know how to make money. They've been doing it for a long time. They're not just going to hold an office for a few years and go disappear. They are the guys who really understand how to run a financial system. So what did we do? We handed over the issuance of American currency to a private corporation of private bankers. When you see Federal Reserve note on the US dollar, that means it's printed by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, since they came into power just over a century ago, has eroded the purchasing power of the US dollar by 99%. So what was really going on there? Do you think that these investors built up the equity of the United States, made us more profitable? It's exactly the opposite. We have been living in a prolonged economic depression. They just don't call it that because the metrics that we use to measure the economy are coming from a rigged system, just like we saw with LIBOR. Don't bother to look at the Dow Jones. Don't bother to look at the NASDAQ. That has nothing to do with the reality of everyone else and how hard it has become to earn a living. The complete wiping out of the middle class. You have rich and you have poor. And even among the rich, you then have super rich people where a concentrated small cluster of individuals have so much wealth that it could feed entire nations, entire peoples. So this is something that is an economic inequality that must be addressed. And the only way that we're ever really going to learn this is by a collective, massive understanding.
I say the elite powers in control, which is really the same as these central banking dynasties that are basically sitting over the nations. They are a form of global government, except that they are not government at all. They're just dominants. They are dominants. They are the ones that issue the orders to all the nations. As we saw clearly in 1947, after Roswell, we saw these elite powers in control issue these orders to all the nations that anything real that comes up in regards to alien visitors or UFOs must immediately be covered up at all costs, no matter what. And that was that was how that wall, the embargo of truth, that Berlin Wall went up originally in 1947. And that's an example of them in action over the nations. And that's the reason why disclosure and the images that conjures up in our minds is not a real thing, really, because the nations, whether you're talking about the United States or any place else, they don't have the actual agenda of aliens to reveal. They're not on the inside of that. They really aren't. Nations just follow orders. That's all they do. And that's what they're doing now, and that's what they always do. And when you see them all doing something strange or something that seems out of the ordinary, it's because they're following the orders of the elite powers in control.
We're looking at. So let's look at some of the bills that they're using to thwart the system of democracy. And of course, we've heard a lot about the disinformation czar, and she is quite a panic. I'm going to try not to focus on her so much, but boy, what a character. So Homeland Security itself, this is how they're portraying this. Let's start with this. Department of Homeland Security Internal Working Group protects free speech and other fundamental rights when addressing disinformation that threatens the security of the United States. I'm surprised they didn't say Homeland. They don't like to say United States. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security is charged with safeguarding the United States. Hold on. That's the military's job under the Constitution, provide for the common defense. It's not really. The Department of Homeland Security, is extra constitutional in this sense. But anyway. Against threats to its security, including threats exacerbated by disinformation. What they call disinformation is anything that's against the regime. And this is the nature of the problem. And there's a certain regime in there that, needs this kind of cover. And they've thrown out a lot of loyalists and taken on a lot of people during this 2 decades of power. And now the people that are embedded in there, a lot of them are Obama people, in fact, and they're all loyal to Stepford Biden for now, while his cognitive decline, doesn't completely take him out. So we're looking there at what they're trying to introduce with the Department of Homeland Security with this new Disinformation Governance Board. And they're claiming that it's related. Believe it or not, they say, well, Hurricane Sandy, for example, that would have been affected by disinformation. They're trying to make these connections where there are none. So if they don't like, for example, the way that I talk about the UFO file and the phony CIA threat around the UFOs, then that's disinformation and it's dangerous. It's just as dangerous as, Ukraine-Russia war propaganda. So in fact, the country is based and, has it ensconced in the Constitution, free speech. It's right there. It's the First Amendment. It's the number one most important thing. So the founders understood and discovered, and they realized that without free speech, you don't get anywhere. That's how the king locked people down. So by creating this system, they created this great leveling where the average person would have the ability to influence the government and could tell his fellow citizens what was going on. Now, what we're looking at, they need to get rid of that mechanism. And we've seen them squelch stories that were important, of course, in the last election, the Hunter Biden laptop story. Now that's come out. And this has been, absolutely crucial data was left on the cutting room floor because Twitter and Facebook blocked it. And so we got into a real crisis there of the Constitution. That was a real red line when they prevented the New York Post from publishing the story on these platforms. We didn't take the message then, and now we're stuck with this situation. And now it is kind of a fight on a level that, can be very dramatic because these people are desperate. I believe that in their psychosis, they thought with the COVID op and the Ukraine war, they just, take over. And I think that's what's in the back of their minds. But the problem is that all of them have sworn an oath to the Constitution. And every aspect of government, from judges to presidents to senators to Congress people, swear an oath to that Constitution. So they have to change the meaning of free speech in these documents. That's what they're going to try to do. Let's look at some of the articles covering this, because even the people that are on their side are shocked and dismayed at the arrogance of the push to just take away the ability for free speech so openly.
Well, here's a story that no one in the corporate media is covering except our next guest. The Biden and Harris administration colluded with big tech and the Justin Trudeau regime to undermine the Canadian Freedom Truckers. Yes, the Biden and Harris regime colluding with Justin Trudeau to undermine the Freedom Trucker convoy in Canada. This is a bombshell story, and the man responsible for covering it is David Creighton, who writes at the Post Millennial. David, this is a really shocking story, but I guess shocking to a lot of people who aren't paying attention, not surprising. Walk us through this story if you can.
Well, Clayton, it's quite incredible because this story came to me completely by accident, as it did to the people who first received it, a group called Guns of America, which is, if you're a firearm owner, you know who they are. And they did a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of Homeland Security. And it had nothing to do with the Freedom Convoy in Canada. Nothing at all. They were just trying to see if they were on the radar in terms of what does DHS have in store for us? Are they surveying us? Are they tapping into anything we're doing? Is there anything we should be worried about? So they put an access request in. And what they got back was a bombshell that they didn't even realize at first how much of a bombshell. For some reason, their request triggered Freedom Convoy, which of course was the Freedom Convoy in Canada fighting the COVID-19 mandates in February 2022. And the documents that came back were just incredible. And the one that is perhaps most damning for the Biden administration is the one that reads, and this is an actual email within the Disinformation Governance Board. You recalled who that group is. That was the one headed up, of course, by Jankowicz. So you recently put her infamous TikTok.
Singing Mary Poppins songs. Yeah, Nina Jankowicz.
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
yes.
exactly.
The song and dance woman who, of course, joyfully talks about redacting and censoring the world, ridding the world of anything she considers disinformation. So here's how they talked in her department about, we asked about recent reports with foreign accounts spreading or generating content associated with the Freedom Convoy. News about Meta taking action to deplatform these accounts broke right before the meeting. The email reads, I&A had some feedback about its capabilities in this area, which I look forward to sharing with you. We discussed whether engaging with Meta and Twitter to share information convoy-related matters, inauthentic activity violating terms of service, if that would be prudent. We will circle back with I&A on that tomorrow. CBB is supportive of engagement with. We agree that we need to set up a formal structure for these analytic exchanges. So clearly, you don't have to be an idiot or even that perceptive to understand they're talking about the Biden administration colluding with big social media, which we, of course, learned from the Twitter files they were doing. The Biden administration was dealing with Meta and Twitter at that time, the pre-Elon Musk Twitter, before this BS stopped, and social media platforms telling them to deplatform people, telling them to censor information, telling them to take information off, and they were obeying. And this is hard, concrete evidence that they did that towards the Freedom Convoy. They told them to take down websites. They told them to take down information that they deemed to be contrary to the Trudeau government and the Biden administration. Now it gets even better, because this is a write-up from the White House. And it says, this is a report of a meeting between Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden on February the 11th, 2022. And this is called the White House Readout. This is a paper that comes out every time Joe Biden has an official meeting with anybody. It says, in turn, the Prime Minister thanked the President and his administration, the Governor of Michigan, and U.S. officials for all of the assistance that the United States is providing to resolve this disruption, meaning the Freedom Convoy dispute and, at the time, the border dispute. The two leaders agreed to stay in close touch in the days ahead to ensure that the free flow of traffic is restored at these vital transit points. Now, I interviewed Gord McGill on Tuesday, actually. Now, Gord McGill is a trucker. He was at the Freedom Convoy. He's now an independent journalist, and he also writes for Newsweek every week about freedom-related issues and things like that. And he's been on Tucker Carlson's show talking about these very things. I've been in contact with him now for many weeks. We've been talking about this, and he shared these documents with me the other day, and he wasn't even aware before he read through the entire 165 pages of documents what he had in his hands. So I interviewed Gord the other day, and he said what's really telling in this correspondence is the word assistance. He says clearly the United States could offer Canada no assistance in putting down the Freedom Convoy. In fact, the Trudeau government and the Ontario government actually tried to get U.S. tow trucks to cross the border to remove these trucks that were on the streets in Ottawa. The U.S. tow truck firms, 100% of them all said, pound sand. We're not doing it.
No way we're doing that. No way we're doing that. Exactly.
Exactly. And as Gord pointed out to me, he said there was no assistance offered from any American company or any American utility to put down the Freedom Convoy protest. The only assistance offered was clearly in the other email relating to actually deplatforming the Freedom Convoy. That was clearly the assistance that Joe Biden offered Justin Trudeau. This is absolutely
amazing.
Shocking.
It is shocking. It is amazing. So United States, you have Americans and American companies who are near the border, tow trucking companies and others that said absolutely not. We stand with our brothers and sisters up there in Canada who are a part of this Freedom Convoy. We are not offering assistance. We are not going to go up there and tow these trucks. Absolutely not. Even though there was blockades, of course, going across the border, and all of that. So the only assistance actually came from the Biden administration, strong-arming social media companies to block information and deplatform members of the trucker convoy. And I remember it was odd because in the United States, for those of our American viewers will remember, it was difficult to get information about the Freedom Convoy on social media. It was you couldn't really find it. Now we know why.
Precisely. That the information was being blocked. And I've talked to several of the organizers like Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, and they said the same thing. It was difficult to get their message out, even to their own people. And this is the irony of this, Clayton, is that these, like Tamara Leach and Chris Barber are still up on charges, and their trial resumes next week for mischief, apparently for fomenting rebellion and insurrection and non-peaceful protest. And all of the messages they put out on social media urged people to demonstrate peacefully. 100% of them. I've listened to every one of them. And in fact, the prosecution keeps playing these and doesn't see the irony of playing these recordings. But Tamara and Chris have both told me they had trouble getting these social media messages out to even their own followers, out to even their own Freedom Convoy participants. So there's the irony, is that the Biden administration was working to create violent protest by reducing the opportunity of people like Tamara Leach and Chris Barber to get that message out to the truckers. Thankfully, they were sensible people and they didn't need coaching.
Right. I'll get you out of here on this, David. Do we know what the Trudeau side of this is yet in their relationship? Have we seen complementary documents on the Canadian side supporting the sort of back and forth? We have these Freedom of Information Act requests from the Biden administration side, but what about on the Trudeau side?
85% of the documents related to the Freedom Convoy have yet to be released. There are a number of requests. In fact, I think I should do one myself because I've been relying on other people to do this. They're being stonewalled. In Canada, it's called an access to information request as opposed to a freedom of information request. But it's the same procedure. And I used to deal with these actually from the other side when I was in uniform in the military. We used to get them constantly, and we had to, of course, process them. I have done my own when I worked with the official opposition, and I've done my own as a journalist. It is a fairly simple procedure, and the government should not be stonewalling. It's contrary to law to do so. So what is going on with these documents? I think there's a huge story here yet to be heard about the Canadian connection, because so many people have resigned over the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And this meeting between Biden and Trudeau occurred just 3 days before February 14th, 2022, when Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, which of course has since been declared unconstitutional by a superior or federal judge. So this whole thing stinks on both sides of the border. And if this is not revealed, and if we don't get answers on this, you can bet Trudeau will try this again the next time a crisis comes along, whether it's another pandemic or whether it's a crisis of his own making.
Hallelujah. You're absolutely right about that. And, Kamala Harris right now is campaigning on the concept of freedom. That's a big part of her platform now. Freedom, as we've talked about here on Redacted, and we're going to do a deep dive on that in moments here on the show. But that's so freedom. Freedom to do what? Freedom to clamp down on speech. Freedom to only put out a certain narrative that the regime wants you to hear. That's unbelievable. And it's an unbelievable story, really it is. And so now we know the Biden and Harris administration colluded with the Justin Trudeau administration and big tech to silence the Canadian Freedom Convoy and the truckers there. And they won't stop. They won't stop. David, great reporting on this. Thank you for your work at the Post Millennial, and keep on this great story. This is unbelievable. Thanks, David.
Thanks so much, Clayton. It's a pleasure to be on the show again.
After we get through this Morrison thing, I'm going to give you something special on that. But let's do the Morrison thing, because I think it's significant in demonstrating how COG works and may answer that last question. All right. So Scott Morrison was extremely unpopular during the lockdowns because of the fascist abilities that he exercised there in Australia. And they had tremendous problems with him, kind of worse, I think, than any other country. If you think even of like France and other places like that, they had their problems. But Morrison had just some of the most jackbooted lockdown policies that were beyond bizarre. But that was a real tryout for this New World Order structure. Okay, but something happened. So he lost the election because of his unpopular policies, but he still remained a member of parliament. Well, interestingly enough, recently some things came out about what he was doing as prime minister, and watch how the emergency powers operate, because it's very instructional. Secret powers of an Australian prime minister now revealed. This is New York Times. Even they have to turn this guy in. Scott Morrison was busy during the pandemic. In addition to being prime minister, he covertly put himself in charge, covertly, remember, that's in secret, put himself in charge of 5 ministries. That's like saying, I'm defense secretary, I'm treasury secretary, I'm housing secretary, I'm secretary of state and president too, but I'm not telling you. Critics say he damaged democracy. Okay. Let's go with this a little bit. Australian slam former leader for secretly taking 5, count them 5, cabinet jobs. So this is the consolidation of all those jobs into one person. So therefore, if I make a move and I say, well, I have this new COVID policy and I'm calling martial law, basically, there's nobody in the cabinet to disagree because I have all the jobs. And that's exactly how it worked. This is the guy going off to have a cabinet meeting. I kid you not. He's having a cabinet meeting with himself. So he's taking his meeting notes there, and he's like, I can't wait to be there to greet myself.
It's like a Monty Python sketch.
Yes. Scott Morrison, Australian ex-PM, resists pressure to step down because he's still in Parliament. He's still a member. Former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has resisted calls to resign from Parliament after news emerged that he'd secretly assumed 5 additional roles during his tenure. And again, he did it in secret, so nobody knew. That's our friend Morrison. That's why Australia got so screwed up. Scott Morrison's ministerial grab holds lessons beyond Australia. You bet your life it does. These people can just do this in the background, sign a secret note covertly, and suddenly, voila, I have 5 different positions. Can you imagine Stepford Biden being like, I'm defense secretary? All right. Here's a little bit from that article on Morrison. That's not my job was uttered so often by Scott Morrison in his final months as Australia's prime minister that the phrase became a running joke. As it turns out, he had far more jobs than voters. Parliament, or indeed some of his own cabinet, realized while in power, Morrison quietly appointed himself to 5 other ministries during the pandemic, in some cases without the knowledge of the relevant ministers. In other words, I'm just doing this. It's got no oversight. Nobody else knows about it. I'm just assuming those jobs. This is how the emergency powers work, because if they were moving to consolidate and take that martial law step, it was up in the air. They were deciding on it, but they needed those positions consolidated. And then he could step forward and do it. There'd be no opposition because he was doing all the jobs. The revelations this week have ignited a firestorm, raising questions of accountability, transparency, and the concentration of power. They are questions not just for Morrison, but also for Australia and other democracies around the world. The pandemic provided the perfect fig leaf for strongmen in more authoritarian systems to amass power. And they go after the Hungary guy because he threw George Soros out. But what we have there is a very clear-cut case. Okay, now let's jump to Canada. In Canada, they did the same thing. They called the emergency powers against the truckers during the trucker protests. And remember, he's operating with under 30% popularity. But interestingly enough, he created a new cabinet position because she was the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, who used to cozy up to all the Russian oligarchs in the 90s and the early 2000s. And she was a journalist, actually. And here she shows up as this kind of totalitarian dictator along with Trudeau. Very odd indeed, except she's been working on George Soros's biography and working directly with Soros for a decade. So it explains a lot there. But here's what's interesting that they did. They created a new position, and the position was Deputy Prime Minister. So here we have them again, sort of, giving her 2 jobs, just like Morrison is picking up jobs. And the idea is, if I have enough phony positions, I can consolidate this thing. Now, this is the actual succession in the case that they lose the president. And it's the vice president, then it goes to the Speaker of the House, which is Nancy Pelosi, as we know. The president of the Senate, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Defense, Attorney General, and online down it goes, right down to the Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, however, continuity of government works entirely differently. And I want to really show how the Democrats at the end of the Trump administration were pushing the idea that Nancy Pelosi was going to become president as a result of this when they called continuity of government. That's not the way that it works. In continuity of government, the line of succession goes directly to the NORTHCOM commander. And the NORTHCOM commander is the combatant commander of the United States. He takes over and runs martial law in America. That's the way that it would work. So if they called this emergency, that's what we would get, in fact, not Nancy Pelosi or even the vice president at this point. So let's go back. I want to prove this up because, I get emails from time to time from people who say, I don't remember them trying to do continuity of government during Trump. And I can appreciate it because actually a lot of it was scrubbed from the internet. And when I went back to find some of it, I was shocked because many of the stories I had bookmarked weren't there anymore. But I had saved a number of them in any case. This is from October 4th, 2020, when Trump announced, I have COVID, right? And they were deciding at this point, can they utilize continuity of government to oust him and do that whole thing? Or should they go with this whole mail-in ballot thing? Secretly, this summer, the White House beefed up planning if Trump got COVID-19. A hospitalized president, a continuity crisis. There it is in October of 2020. Let's go further still. Pelosi, continuity of government in place after Trump tests positive. Here she is. And again, the presumption here that she's working with is she's going to be president. That's not how continuity of government works. The idea being, if Trump and Pence were, both got COVID, then she would take over. No, actually, interestingly enough, the NORTHCOM commander would, General Van Herk. And that still is the case today. If they press the button on continuity of government, for any reason. And by the way, one of the things that they've included in that and talk about quite often is a cyber attack. Oh, the Russians are cyber attacking us. We need continuity of government. There's a lot of different reasons that they could call it out. And having a weak, senile president in Stepford Biden the way we do now, it's kind of ideal for them to be looking at this. But here's the rest of that article from Pelosi. Reuters, U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that plans for continuing the government should President Donald Trump become incapacitated remain in place. Pelosi said she'd been tested and would know the test of her own results and blah, blah, blah. And then in the article, it goes, the Democratic speaker is next in the line of succession after Vice President Mike Pence. And it's very interesting. They're whole ignoring the Northcom takeover guy. Now, in terms of these articles disappearing, I'm going to show this one because this article disappeared. It was from Yahoo. And it says, an exhausted Trump's long path to coronavirus. Questions of government continuity arose in ways that haven't in years. Trump's diagnosis amounted to the most serious health threat to an American president. And this is the whole article there. Now, what's interesting is you can try in 90 different ways to get the actual article, and you can't. But the leftover is there, that little vestige of what they were trying to do and the explanation of the article. When you go there, it'll just blow you into wide open random Yahoo-ness. And I've tried a number of different ways to get that original article, but this is what they were pushing. And there was a reason why they were doing this. Now, the continuity of government structure would place us under Northcom, but it would also give us regional governors, and the regions would be taken over by different military officials through Northcom, and they would divvy up resources and things of this nature. Now, I'm not saying this to scare us and to be like a fear porn thing. What I want to do is give us that clear outline of what they're talking about when they get to emergency powers. And I want to point out the commander for COG now. This is Northcom commander. Of course, he's a general doing the job for Northcom, like any other general. You know, I can't really say that one would be better than the other, but I can say that that structure they've been building for COG to take over for a long time. Northcom commander working to advance defense. This is from last week, and he's been doing a lot of press conferences, I've noticed. I've introduced General Van Herk before. The person, the general who had the job before him, he was very public during COVID. And, you know, the Northcom commanders, they reside deep in those bunkers, and you never see them come out and give interviews. It just doesn't happen. His presence and Newsweek suddenly wanting to talk about COG, you couldn't talk about COG in open session in Congress. That's what it had been like. And you weren't allowed to mention it. And suddenly Newsweek was interested in saying, hey, COG, you know, this guy could take over. And you had a lot of things like this, exclusive, inside the military's top secret plans if coronavirus cripples the government. Yeah, they were going to take over. They were thinking to themselves, well, we're going to have to oust Trump one way or another. Should we do it with this or just take the election? It's one of the two. And on Van Herk, again, the four-star general who will command the U.S. if government is crippled by coronavirus. Military puts plans in place for extraordinary circumstances and martial law. That's the Daily Mail in the UK. They're talking about it openly. So that, you know, if that happens, well, you heard about it in the Daily Mail, didn't you? Newsweek reports that U.S. military planners are looking at a range of radical hypotheticals around the coronavirus crisis. Should the country's top politicians be struck down by COVID-19 and civil government be incapacitated, martial law could be imposed. The combatant commander, the Northcom commander, Van Herk, for the United States would leave the country if Washington were crippled. Let me say it again. The combatant commander, that's the Northcom general, Van Herk, for the United States would lead the country if Washington were crippled or Stepford Biden stopped working. The scenario appears unlikely, but there are also current debates about whether armed forces could be allowed to exercise emergency authority. The military could possibly serve as a policing function if widespread violence breaks out due to food shortages or financial chaos caused by the coronavirus. Whenever they float things, just like I've asked people to pay attention to the UFO threat meme that's out there in the media, when they float these things around there, they're trial balloons. They're trying to see, how do people feel about this? Could we get away with it? So the fact that they're talking about it in relation to Van Herk taking over the country is pretty disturbing.
As a result, we are where we are today, which is in a period of crisis. And we have two crises, and they both derive from the same condition. And that condition is the emergence of the domination of corporate power over American democracy that accelerated beginning in 2010 with the Citizens United case that unleashed a tsunami of corporate money into the American political process. And both parties are now captured by that corporate money. And they've lost any kind of authentic connection to the American people or to the populist goals of the Republic and of democracy. On the Republican side, President Biden promised the last time around that he was going to drain the swamp. But instead, he came in and he appointed a pharmaceutical lobbyist and CEO to run HHS, Verizon lobbyist to run the FCC, a Goldman Sachs CEO to run the Treasury Department, an oil lobbyist to run the Interior Department, a coal lobbyist to run the Environmental Protection Agency, and so on. And only today, President Trump has announced that in his new administration, should he win this election, that Jamie Dimon will be his choice as Commerce Secretary, and that Larry Fink, the director of BlackRock, will run the Treasury Department. This is the swamp. These are swamp creatures. And his pick as vice president is a salute to the CIA and to the intelligence community and to the military-industrial complex. Their gravy train is going to continue. And President Trump has a connection to the American people, a populist connection, but in many ways it's the same fraudulent connection that we saw with the DNC over the past year, concealing the real purpose of their objectives, which was to give us a president that represents corporate interests rather than the interests of the American public. We've seen two presidents who aren't really addressing any of the issues that are critical to our country. We have, if you look at President Biden and President Trump, you can look at them and say these are very different people. Their dispositions are different, their personalities are different, their expressed ideologies are very, very different. Their approach to politics could not be more distinct. But if you actually look at the policies over which they differ, over the landscapes in which they're staging this election, it's a very narrow Overton window of guns, of culture war issues, of abortion, of trans rights, etc. And the big existential issues that are actually facing our country are never addressed. The biggest of these, perhaps, is the national debt, which is now $34 trillion. The service on that debt alone is now greater than our military budget. Within 5 years, 50 cents out of every dollar that we collect in taxes will go to servicing that debt. Within 10 years, 100%. This is not sustainable. President Biden, President Trump offer no solutions. President Biden, on his webpage, has no policy issues addressing this or any other policy. He has a picture of himself and saying that we're going to finish the job. but he doesn't tell what job he's going to finish. If it's the job of running up the deficit till it's completely unsustainable, that's something that the American people should know about. President Biden can't talk about it, and President Trump can't talk about it because they're the ones chiefly responsible for running up that debt. President Trump came into office saying he was going to run the presidency as a business. He was going to balance the federal budget. And instead, he ran up an $8 trillion debt, more than all the presidents combined since George Washington. And President Biden is now on track to beat that number. So neither of them are even going to talk about this most existential issue.
I said to Cameron and Osborne, because they were lauded that they're these great politicians. I said to them, we don't really need politics. Politics is when I'm selling you something that's not going to be any good for you, and I've got to make you buy it and like it. It's a snake oil salesman. I said, what we need is policies that are going to improve the lives of our constituents, make them happier, feel safer, improve their economic outlook and the prospects for their children. So as long as we do that, we'll get re-elected, because that's delivering for the people. And Cameron Osborne said to me at the time, you don't understand, Andrew, it's all a game. Well, having seen what's gone on over the last 5 years, I think I do understand what they mean now. And yes, they're just playing a different game. And that is the Punch and Judy pantomime that you see played out in Parliament all the time. Well, all the time, they're actually colluding to stitch up the people. And those policies I've just told you about the Defence Union, the WHO, it's very interesting that they're all sort of been slid in there. No one wants to talk about, the leaders' debates. They didn't say, Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, you're signing our army to the unelected EU.
Which could see German, after 2 world wars, could see Germans in command of British armed forces.
Well, I was the MP that, under Cameron, when I got tipped off that our troops in Bosnia were wearing the EU symbol on their uniforms, made them take it off.
We could see foreign armies stationed in this country,
yes,
and our army used to go and suppress
somebody else,
people fighting back in other countries.
And our police as well. Our local police forces would come under EU control.
Who is behind it all? Who are the shadowy powers behind everything? What is it? Some people say
it's Agenda 2030, and all the parties are committed to Agenda 2030. And you read through the lines, they want to break down the borders between countries. I mean, that's why they hated it that much, that we had a referendum and the people voted to leave the European Union. It just makes us far harder to manage.
Do they want some sort of...
They hated it, Trump being elected in 2016. That's why I think they're pushing on so fast now with Agenda 2030, inflicting low-traffic neighbourhoods on people who never voted for them, didn't want them, 15-minute cities.
Keeping people tied to the
pushing
area.
The lunacy of electric vehicles, There
aren't the minerals in the world.
There aren't the minerals. Any salt water on the batteries, they can explode. You can't take them on ferries across the North Sea because they can't get the insurance. That explosion in a battery of an electric vehicle in Luton Airport car park took the whole car park out. I mean, what's your insurance going to be? The guidance now, if you have an electric vehicle and you have a bump on the motorway, because of the risk of the damage to the battery and the explosion, the official guidelines are, it has to go into a garage and have no other vehicle within 45 feet of any direction. How big a garage are you going to need to repair electric vehicles with 45 feet all round, no other vehicles? It's just ludicrous. These policies to destroy people's freedoms, livelihoods, it's pure propaganda. There's no science behind any of this.
So your solution to this is independence and direct democracy. Explain how you think that works.
Well, when we expose what's really been going on across government, it's going to be a huge breakdown of trust, quite rightly, in health, science and politics. And people are going to have to be held to account. People who've been in positions of responsibility. They want the pay, they want the perks, but they never want to take responsibility for their actions. And it's only that is going to restore any public confidence that people are not going to do this to them again. And it's been done for a very, very long time. The fact is now that people are waking up, aren't they? You saw that on the doorsteps today and on the streets.
Lots of people support
Lots
you.
of people are waking up, and they're not going back to sleep. Which is why we need they need a big war to look over here and give you something to worry about, and everything else just slips away. What's been shocking is that all the institutions there to protect the public interest have failed, whether that's the medical regulators, the health guidelines, they've all failed. Parliament's failed. I'm sorry. Parliament, which I've been a part of, I've done my best, but we have failed the people, which is, and the government are getting the blame, but it's the Uni Party, it's the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats and the SNP as well. They're all party to it, of the not talking about the WHO, not talking about excess deaths, not talking about vaccine harms, not talking about really the impact of net zero and a policy that's probably going to cost £5 trillion to implement. What, and Labour are going to do it in 6 years? This is crazy, absolute madness. And it's all unnecessary anyway. We're not in a climate emergency. There is no climate emergency. But the politicians have realised that keeping people poorer, badly educated and indoctrinated, ill and scared, makes people much easier to control. This is about control of the population. I don't think we're going to have many more elections like the one that we're having in a couple of weeks' time, quite honestly, because the system is so broken. If it was up to me, I would get rid of the House of Lords immediately. I think no one's spoken up from the House of Lords. They've not protected the public interest. I would get rid of half of the MPs. And I would say that if you serve as an MP, you have no external interests. You can have no external interests at all while you're an MP. And I would have referendums every 3 months on all the legislation, a public debate, so that the public became the government again. Democracy is from the Greek. Demos is the people and kratos is power. I don't think the people feel very powerful. I think they're actually in fear of what Parliament's going to do to them next and inflict on them. I think we've got into a situation where politicians have forgotten that we work for the people. We work for the people. They don't work for us. We answer to the people. That's all been lost. We're currently in a situation, to paraphrase Tony Benn, where the people are scared of the politicians, and that is tyranny. That's where we are. What are they going to inflict on us next? And we need to get back to a situation where the politicians are scared of the people, and that's democracy.